Lila had always been aware of the marked dot. It was the first thing people noticed about her, or at least that's what she believed. A faint reddish-brown patch curved across her left cheek, stretching delicately from the corner of her eye to the line of her jaw. Doctors had called it a birthmark, harmless and unremarkable. But to Lila, it was anything but harmless. It was a mirror she could never escape, a reminder stitched into her very skin. She remembered being a child, standing in front of the bathroom mirror, tugging at her face as if she could peel the mark away. She remembered the whispers in school, the careless cruelty of children who pointed and laughed, calling her names she pretended not to hear but carried deep inside. Some teachers tried to hush the teasing, but words had already left scars invisible to anyone but her dot. As she grew older, she developed rituals of concealment. Foundation and concealer became her armor, applied with meticulous precision each morning. She learned to angle her face in photos, to stand where shadows fell just right, to lower her gaze when speaking to strangers. To the world she was quiet, polite, maybe even shy. But beneath her silence there was fear, the constant worry that someone would notice the imperfection she fought so hard to hide, that it wasn't that she lacked beauty. Her dark eyes carried a softness that drew people in, and her smile, when it came, lit her face with warmth. Yet Lila could never believe these things outweighed the mark. Compliments about her looks felt hollow, as if people said them out of pity. She would laugh them off, change the subject, and later stand in front of the mirror again, staring at the reflection she struggled to love, her parents. Gentle and loving, often told her it was nothing to be ashamed of. "It's part of you, Lila," her mother would say, brushing a strand of hair from her face. But even those words felt distant. Her mother didn't have to walk into rooms wondering who might stare. Her father didn't have to hear whispers from strangers on the bus. To Lila, their reassurances felt kind but incomplete. So she carved out a small, safe life. She worked at the library, where silence reigned and books never judged. There, she could slip into the background, blending with the rows of shelves and the quiet hum of turning pages. She liked the anonymity it gave her. Most patrons were too absorbed in their own thoughts to look closely at her, and she kept her interactions brief. "Can I help you find a title?" Or, "Your books are due back in 2 weeks." Nothing more. But even in the sanctuary of the library, her insecurity lingered like a shadow. When a child tugged at their parent's sleeve and whispered, "What's that on her face?" she would pretend not to hear. When groups of students came in laughing, she lowered her head, afraid their amusement might shift toward her. She longed for invisibility, yet felt the ache of loneliness that came with it. At night, when the makeup was washed away and she faced her bare reflection, the mark seemed to grow larger under the bathroom light. She would trace it with her fingertip, not in hatred but in weary resignation. This was her reality. She had stopped dreaming of fairy tale romances or being the girl someone called beautiful without hesitation. Those belonged to other women, ones with flawless skin, the ones who didn't have to explain themselves before they were seen. And yet, buried beneath her layers of doubt, there was a quiet yearning, a fragile hope she hardly admitted to herself, that someday someone might look at her, at all of her, and see not a flaw to be hidden, but a face worth loving. Lila's world was a quiet one, deliberately built around stillness. She lived alone, in a modest apartment above a bakery where the smell of fresh bread drifted up every morning. Her walls were lined with second-hand bookshelves, overflowing with novels and poetry collections she had rescued from clearance bins. Each evening after work, she curled up on her sofa with a cup of tea and a book, letting words become her companions. Her mornings followed a careful rhythm. Wake at 6, wash her face, apply the familiar mask of concealer and foundation. She worked slowly, blending and layering until the mark was softened to something she thought others might overlook. Then a neat bun, simple clothes in muted colors, gray, navy, cream clothing that didn't demand attention. She believed invisibility was safety, and she clung to it like a shield dot at the library. She was reliable, dependable, and visible in the best way. The other librarians liked her well enough. She was kind, always willing to take an extra shift if someone needed, but she never joined them for after-work dinners. She always had an excuse. I'm tired, or I've got something to do at home. In truth, she dreaded the idea of being in a crowded restaurant, of laughter ringing out while she tried to hide the angle of her face under dim lighting. Her coworkers sometimes teased her gently, "You're always hiding in the shelves, Lila," but they said it with affection. To them, she was simply quiet, maybe a little shy. None of them realized how much of her life was shaped by fear. The library itself was her comfort. The scent of old pages, the hush of footsteps on carpet, the soft thud of books closing, these were her favorite sounds. She loved shelving returns, running her fingers across spines as she placed each book back where it belonged. Sometimes, when no one was around, she would pause to read a line or two before sliding the book onto the shelf. In those moments, surrounded by stories, she felt safe, almost hidden in plain sight. Children were her one soft spot. When parents brought them in for story hour, Lila volunteered to read. She always chose tales with brave heroines or magical journeys, and though she kept her voice gentle, the children leaned in, wide-eyed. For a while, she forgot about herself. Their innocence reminded her of what life had felt like before she had become so self-conscious before mirrors had become enemies. But occasionally, a child's blunt honesty would cut through. "What's on your face?" they would ask, not cruelly, just curious. And she would freeze, heart-hammering, until a parent quickly hushed them. Outside of work, her life was predictable. Groceries on Sunday morning, laundry in the afternoon, long walks in the park when the weather was kind. She avoided parties, avoided strangers' eyes, avoided situations where someone might ask too many questions. To the few acquaintances she had, she was simply a private person who preferred solitude. But deep down, she knew it wasn't solitude she wanted, it was safety from being seen. Sometimes she wondered if this was all her life would be. The thought both comforted and frightened her. Comforted, because quiet meant no one could hurt her. Frightened, because she longed for more. She longed for someone to share her love of books, someone who might laugh with her over tea, someone who wouldn't flinch at the sight of her bare face. But longing was dangerous, she told herself. Better to keep to routine, better not to hope. She folded her dreams neatly away, like fragile letters tucked in a drawer. She convinced herself she didn't need more than her books, her tea, her quiet. Yet, even in the safety of her routines, life had its surprises. And soon, the library, the one place she thought she could remain unseen, would bring someone into her quiet world who would change everything. It began on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that slid by unnoticed. The library was quiet, filled only with the soft murmur of pages turning and the occasional squeak of a chair against the carpet. Rain tapped lightly against the tall windows, casting the world outside in gray watercolor. Lila sat at the reference desk, sorting a small pile of returned books. Her movements were automatic, practiced. Open the cover, glance at the due date, stamp the return slip, stacked neatly. She barely looked up when the door creaked open and someone walked in. People came and went all day, most absorbed in their own errands, but she noticed this man. He wasn't extraordinary at first glance tall, a little broad-shouldered, wearing a coat still damp from the drizzle. His hair was dark, slightly disheveled, as if he hadn't bothered with an umbrella. He carried no umbrella, in fact only a leather satchel that looked well used, its edges worn from years of travel. He walked straight toward the poetry shelves, his steps confident yet unhurried. Lila tracked him only with the corner of her eye, then quickly dropped her gaze back to her work. Another patron, she told herself. Nothing more. But minutes later, he reappeared at her desk. He carried 3 slim books in his hands, their spines faded from age. He set them down gently as though they were fragile things. "Excuse me," he said, his voice warm, steady. "Do you know if you have any more of Eliot's poems in the archives?" The shelves only had these. Lila froze for half a second. Most people came for new releases or children's books, not Eliot. She forced her voice into its usual professional calm. "We keep some older editions in the back," she said quietly. "Would you like me to check?" He smiled, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. "If it isn't too much trouble." She nodded and slipped away to the archive room, her pulse oddly quickened. Poetry lovers were rare, and something about his interest stirred a tiny flicker of curiosity. When she returned with 2 more Eliot volumes, he seemed genuinely delighted. "You've just saved me from rereading the same verses for the 10th time," he said, carefully accepting the books. Lila almost smiled back, but she caught herself. Instead, she gave a polite nod. "Happy to help." He lingered a moment longer, as though searching for words. "Do you read much poetry yourself?" Her throat tightened. She wasn't used to patrons asking about her. Usually conversations were brief and impersonal. "Sometimes," she admitted softly. "What's your favorite?" The question startled her. She glanced down at the desk, avoiding his eyes. "It changes," she murmured. "Lately, maybe Mary Oliver." He brightened, clearly pleased. "Ah, tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" That line alone is worth carrying around forever. Her lips parted in surprise. He didn't just know Oliver, he quoted her effortlessly. Something inside her stirred, a mixture of admiration and unease. She quickly busied herself with rearranging the returned stack of books. "She has a way with words," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "I'm Daniel, by the way," he offered, with a gentle nod. "Thanks for the help, Lila." She stiffened. She hadn't told him her name, but then remembered she wore a name tag. Of course. Still, hearing him say it felt strangely intimate, as if her name belonged differently in his voice. He left soon after, carrying the books under his arm. She watched him go, then shook herself back into routine. "Just a patron?" she reminded herself. Don't think about it, but she did think about it. All through the afternoon, as rain drummed the windows, she found her thoughts circling back to the man who loved poetry. Daniel returned 2 days later. Lila noticed him immediately, though she tried not to let it show. The library was busier that morning, filled with the rustle of jackets and chatter of students preparing for exams. Yet even in the crowd, his presence felt distinct. He carried himself with a calmness that didn't demand attention, and still, her eyes followed him as he drifted once again toward the poetry shelves. He selected a book, leafed through a few pages, then approached her desk with the same easy confidence as before. "I promise I'm not haunting the library," he said with a small grin. "Though it's not a bad place to haunt, if you ask me." The comment was so unexpected that a soft laugh escaped her before she could stop it. The sound startled her. She rarely laughed with strangers. "You don't need to explain," she murmured, regaining her composure. "Libraries are made for returning visitors." His grin widened, pleased at her reply. "Then I'll take that as encouragement." That day, he lingered longer than before. After checking out his books, he sat at a table near her desk, notebook open, pen in hand. Every so often, she glanced up to see him scribbling furiously, then pausing to stare out the rain-smeared window as though listening for words. She wondered if he was a student, a writer, or just someone who liked to imagine. She wanted to ask, but she didn't doubt it became a pattern. He came in every few days, always with a book or two in hand, always choosing the table nearest her. At first, their exchanges were brief questions about authors, recommendations for reading. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, their conversations grew. "Have you read this one?" he asked one afternoon, sliding a copy of Neruda across the counter. "A few of his poems," she admitted, hesitating before adding, "They're beautiful, intense." Daniel's eyes lit up. "Yes, like they're alive on the page. Do you have a favorite?" She thought for a moment, then shook her head, shy again. "It's hard to choose." "Well," he said, tapping the cover, "maybe you'll discover it while helping me find mine." She blushed at the suggestion but nodded, secretly warmed as weeks passed. He began weaving more of himself into their conversations. He told her he worked as a freelance translator, moving between languages as easily as others moved between rooms. Books were both his passion and his livelihood. He loved poetry because, as he explained once, it says the most with the fewest words, like distilled truth. Lila listened, always quiet, but she found herself speaking more too. She confessed. Her love of Mary Oliver's imagery, her fondness for Brontë novels, even her habit of collecting forgotten books no one else wanted. He never laughed at her quirks, never dismissed her thoughts. Instead, he leaned in as though every word she offered mattered. Still, she kept her guard. She never let the conversations drift into personal territory. If he asked about her life outside the library, she deflected politely. If he lingered too long on her face, she angled away, heart thudding. The birthmark, even hidden beneath makeup, was a weight she carried between them. Yet, despite her defenses, something gentle was blooming. She began to anticipate his visits, scanning the door each afternoon. She caught herself smiling when she saw him enter, and when he left, she felt the faint echo of disappointment. One evening, as he checked out his books, Daniel said, "I think I've read more poetry in the last month than in the last 5 years. Maybe it's your influence." Her eyes widened. "Mine?" He nodded earnestly. "You make it feel alive again, like I'm not reading alone." Lila looked down quickly, cheeks warm. She didn't know what to say, so she stamped his book and slid it back silently. But when he smiled at her one last time before leaving, she realized her quiet life was no longer entirely her own. Someone had stepped into it, gently but surely, and she wasn't sure whether to retreat or let herself be seen. For all the warmth Daniel brought into her days, Lila couldn't silence the gnawing voice inside her. Every time he smiled at her, a flicker of happiness sparked and then quickly dimmed, smothered by the old familiar fear. What if he's only kind because he hasn't noticed yet? What if the moment he sees, he'll turn away like the others? Her mornings became heavier with this thought. She stood longer before the bathroom mirror, layering foundation carefully over her birthmark until her skin looked smooth, flawless even. She practiced her angles in the glass, turning her head slightly this way and that, imagining the way he might see her across the desk. And yet, no matter how perfectly she painted the mask, she knew it was fragile. One swipe of a hand, one unexpected moment, and the truth would show. At the library, her heart worked harder than her hands. When Daniel entered, she felt the room shift as though light followed him in. She cherished their conversations about books, about language, about small observations of the world, but she never let them stretch too far. If he asked about her weekends, she gave vague replies, "I just stayed in." If he wondered whether she wrote herself, she shook her head quickly, not daring to share the poems she kept hidden in notebooks at home. It wasn't that she didn't want to trust him. She did, more than she had ever wanted to trust anyone. But vulnerability, to her, was dangerous. She had learned long ago that people's kindness could falter the moment they saw her fully. Memories surfaced like ghosts. A middle school dance where a boy had refused to hold her hand, whispering to his friends about the stain on her face. A college roommate who once asked bluntly if she had considered surgery to fix it. Even strangers in passing double. Takes on the bus, hushed whispers in grocery aisles had carved their marks into her self-image. Each moment had told her the same story. You are less. You are not beautiful. And so, with Daniel, she built walls even as she longed to tear them down. She angled her face when he spoke to her, letting her hair fall like a curtain. She laughed softly at his jokes but kept her distance, as though any step closer might expose her secret. At times, she caught him studying her not with judgment, but with quiet curiosity, and it made her heart race in equal parts hope and dread. At night, she replayed their exchanges in her mind. She remembered the warmth in his voice, the way he quoted poetry with reverence, the genuine interest he seemed to have in her thoughts. A dangerous hope began to bloom, whispering that maybe he saw her for more than her skin. But then another voice, colder, stronger, would hiss back. He doesn't know yet. Wait until he does. Her guarded heart warred within her. One Saturday morning, she sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at her bare reflection in the darkened window. Her face, unmasked, stared back. She whispered to herself, "This is me." The words felt brittle, fragile, as though the mirror might shatter from the weight of them. She wanted to believe that someone could love her as she was. She wanted to believe Daniel might be different. But years of silence and scars had taught her caution. So she resolved to keep her distance, to enjoy his company only within the safe confines of the library. No more, no less. And yet, deep in her chest, a quiet ache lingered. Because even as she told herself to stay safe, another part of her, the part that read Mary Oliver, the part that believed in wild and precious lives, longed to risk it all. Just once, for the chance to be seen. It happened on a day that began like any other, though fate often disguises turning points as ordinary moments. The morning had been gray, heavy with clouds that promised rain. By mid-afternoon, the storm broke, sheets of water battering the library windows until the world outside blurred. Inside, the lamps glowed softly against the gloom, casting the room in a golden hush. The usual crowd thinned quickly. People hurried home, unwilling to wait out the storm among the stacks. By late afternoon, only a handful of patrons remained. And among them, of course, was Daniel. He slipped through the door, rain dripping from his coat, hair plastered to his forehead. Looked as though he had run through the storm without caring about shelter. Lila, watching from the desk, felt her chest tighten at the sight. "You'll catch cold like that," she murmured when he approached, shaking droplets onto the floor. He chuckled softly. "Worth it for poetry." He held up a slim, rain-spotted notebook as proof. Lila couldn't help but smile, though she ducked her head quickly, pretending to busy herself with a stack of returns. The afternoon wore on peacefully. Daniel settled at his usual table, pen scratching across the page, while Lila continued her work. The rain's steady rhythm against the glass became background music, soothing and relentless. And then the lights flickered, once, twice, then darkness fell. A collective murmur rose from the remaining patrons. Layla's heart jumped. The library wasn't accustomed to power outages. Emergency lights flickered on, dim and sparse, throwing the room into uneven shadows. Somewhere in the distance the storm thundered. "Are you all right?" Daniel's voice broke through the stillness. He was closer than she'd realized, standing now at her desk, notebook under his arm. "Yes," she said quickly, though her pulse was racing. She hated the dimness, hated the way shadows seemed to blur her carefully crafted mask of concealer. Without the bright overhead lights, imperfections stood out more plainly. She could already feel the dampness of the humid, air softening the layers of makeup she had applied that morning. A few patrons gathered near the entrance, waiting for updates. Lila reassured them that the outage was likely temporary, though her own reassurance wavered. She could feel the foundation slipping, melting under the combination of heat and nervous sweat. She excused herself to the restroom, but in the half-lit mirror, panic rose. Streaks of bare skin showed through, the familiar birthmark creeping into visibility. She dabbed frantically with tissue, but the more she pressed, the more uneven it became. There was no fixing it now. She returned to the desk, hard hammering, hoping the dim lights would cloak her enough. But Daniel was still there, waiting, his eyes steady in the half-dark. She avoided his gaze, stacking books that didn't need stacking, flipping pages that didn't need flipping. Her hands shook. She could feel the mark revealed, could feel it announcing itself louder than words. Finally, unable to stand the silence, she whispered so softly she wasn't sure if he heard, "Am I ugly with this birthmark?" The words slipped out raw, trembling, pulled from years of silence. For a heartbeat, the storm outside seemed to hush. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He simply looked at her, really looked, as though nothing about the dim light or fading makeup disturbed him. His gaze was steady, calm, without a trace of shock. Then his voice came, low and sure. "No," he said. "You are the most beautiful to me," Lila's breath caught. She blinked at him, stunned, searching his expression for mockery, pity, anything. That might break the spell, but there was none. His eyes held only truth, as though he had been waiting for her to see herself the way he already did in that fragile moment. Something inside her cracked open something she had guarded for years. The storm raged on outside, but inside she felt the first tremor of peace. The silence that followed Daniel's words was almost unbearable for Lila. Her question, "Am I ugly with this birthmark?" had slipped from her lips before she could pull it back, carried on a tide of panic and vulnerability. And then, his answer firm, unshaken, "No, you are the most beautiful to me." Those words echoed inside her, unfamiliar and overwhelming, like a foreign language she both longed to understand and feared to trust. She had dreamt of hearing them for years from anyone, yet now that they had been spoken, her heart wrestled violently against them. She turned slightly away, hair falling like a shield around her face. The emergency lights cast shadows that seemed to exaggerate the mark across her cheek. She could feel it exposed, raw, a map of shame she had carried since childhood. "You don't mean that," she whispered, her voice tight, almost broken. "You can't. You've seen me like this now. This is why I hide." Her words trembled, spilling out like secrets she had never dared to voice. Her chest ached as if each confession tore at her ribs. Daniel didn't flinch. He stayed close, his voice gentle but steady. "Lila, I meant every word." Her throat closed up. She wanted to believe him, oh, how she wanted to, but doubt rose like a tide. Memories clawed at her. The boy at the dance, the roommate's cruel suggestion, the stranger's whispers. Every moment of rejection swarmed back, screaming against his quiet truth. "People stare," she said, forcing the words out. "They always have. They whisper. They laugh. They make me feel like I'm wrong just for existing like this." Her hands curled into fists against the desk. "So don't tell me it doesn't matter." Daniel's expression softened, not with pity, but with something steadier, something that unnerved her because it felt uncheckable. He reached out, carefully, as though offering rather than insisting, and rested his hand lightly on the desk, near hers. Not touching, just close enough to bridge the space between them. "I can't undo what others have made you feel," he said quietly, "but I can tell you what I see." Lila's breath faltered. Her instinct was to pull back, to retreat into silence, to bury her vulnerability before it unraveled further. Yet his words rooted her in place. "What do you see?" She whispered, afraid of the answer, desperate for it all the same. Daniel met her gaze without hesitation. "I see a woman who hides behind shadows even though she shines brighter than she knows. I see someone who speaks softly, but whose words carry more truth than most people dare to say. I see a face that tells a story and a soul that I want to keep learning from." Her throat tightened until tears pricked her eyes. She turned her head slightly, shaking it as if to reject his words, but her voice betrayed her. "You don't understand. If you really knew me, if you saw me without anything covering it, you'd feel differently. Everyone does." Daniel's hand shifted then, closer, almost brushing hers. "Lila," he said softly, "I do see you, right now. And I don't want to look away." Something inside her cracked wide open. She had lived so long with the certainty that people would leave once they saw the truth. And here he was, looking, truly looking, and refusing to turn away. Her whispered fear lingered, trembling between them like a fragile thread. What if he's lying? What if he changes his mind tomorrow? What if I let myself believe? But another voice, quieter, softer, one she had nearly forgotten, rose in answer. What if, just once, he's telling the truth? For the first time, she didn't know which voice to listen to. And that, more than anything, terrified her. Daniel's words lingered in the dimly lit library, steady as the heartbeat she could hear pounding in her own ears. "I do see you, right now, and I don't want to look away." Lila stood frozen, her hand resting on the counter, her knuckles white with tension. She had waited her whole life for words like these, yet now that they were here, they frightened her more than silence ever had. Because if she let herself believe them and they turned out to be untrue, the fall would be unbearable. Her voice came out thin, almost brittle. "People, they've said things to me my whole life. Cruel things. Do you know what that does to a person?" She swallowed hard, forcing herself to continue. "It makes you believe that you're only what they see, that no matter what's inside, you'll never be enough." Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't rush to fill the silence or offer empty comforts. Instead, he leaned closer, his tone low but unwavering. "I don't know the pain you've carried, Lila. I won't pretend to. But I do know this: other people don't get to decide your worth." Her lips parted in protest, but no words came. He pressed on, his voice firm yet tender. "You are not their whispers. You are not their stares. You're the woman who recommends books like she's giving away pieces of treasure. The woman who lights up when she talks about poetry, even when she doesn't realize it. The woman who has more kindness in her silence than most people have in their noise." Lila blinked rapidly, tears threatening to spill. His words didn't feel rehearsed or pitying. They felt deliberate, chosen with care, as though he had seen her more clearly than anyone else ever had. She shook her head weakly. "But this," her hand lifted, hovering near her cheek, near the birthmark now exposed in the uneven light. Her voice broke. "How can you look at me and say I'm beautiful?" Daniel's gaze didn't waver. Slowly, carefully, he reached out, not to touch, not yet, but to shorten the space between them. His hand rested palm up on the desk, an offering, not a demand. "Because beauty isn't the absence of marks," he said softly. "It's the presence of truth. And you, Lila, you're the most honest, unguarded soul I've ever met. That is beauty to me." Her breath hitched. No one had ever spoken of her that way. She had been called strong, quiet, polite, but never beautiful. Never in a way that felt rooted in something deeper than skin. "You really believe that?" She whispered, the words trembling out of her like a fragile hope. His eyes held hers, unwavering. "With everything in me." The library around them seemed to fade the storm outside. The dim emergency lights, even the lingering hush of other patrons. It felt for that moment as if the world had narrowed to just the two of them. Her fear, his reply, and the fragile bridge forming between them. A single tear slipped down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She couldn't. She was too busy trying to understand the weight of what he had given her. Daniel's hand remained where it was, steady, patient. He didn't push her to take it, didn't press for more than she could give. His presence was enough, and somehow that restraint touched her more deeply than anything else. For years, she had hidden behind walls, certain that anyone who looked too closely would leave. But here was someone who had seen and stayed. Someone who hadn't flinched, hadn't turned away. His reply echoed again in her mind, steady and unyielding. "You are the most beautiful to me." And for the first time, Lila let herself wonder, what if it was true? The days after that storm felt different to Lila, though nothing in her routines had outwardly changed. She still woke at 6, still brewed her tea, still walked to the library beneath the canopy of trees that lined her street. But beneath the familiar rhythms, something stirred. Daniel's words lingered in her mind like a melody she couldn't shake. "You are the most beautiful to me." She had replayed them 100 times, trying to decide if they were real, if they were safe. To hold? Part of her still wanted to dismiss them as kindness, as something he'd said only to soothe her in a fragile moment. And yet his eyes had been steady. His tone had carried no trace of pity. When she remembered that moment, she felt truth humming inside it. For the first time in years, she dared to test life without her mask. One morning, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, concealer in hand. She studied her reflection, the reddish mark along her cheek, the feature she had treated as enemy for so long. Normally, she would begin the ritual of covering, layering, blending. But that morning she set the bottle down. Her heart raced at the thought. The idea of stepping outside barefaced filled her with panic. And yet, another part of her, quiet but insistent, urged her to try. She didn't need to show the world, not yet. But maybe she could show herself. So she spent the day at home, reading, cooking, writing in her journal. No makeup, no mask. At first, she felt exposed even to her own reflection, wincing whenever she passed a mirror. But as hours passed, she noticed something she hadn't before. Her face moved freely. She smiled without worrying about cracks in the paint. She touched her cheek without feeling the chalky residue of foundation. It was liberating in its own small way. At the library, she was slower to take the leap. For the first week after the storm, she still wore her careful layers, still angled her face just so. But when Daniel came, something shifted. She found herself meeting his eyes longer, holding his gaze instead of darting away. She allowed herself small smiles, unguarded, ones that reached her eyes. And every time he met them with a warmth that made her pulse quicken. It wasn't immediate. Years of fear don't dissolve overnight. But piece by piece, Lila began to loosen her grip on shame. She started with tiny acts of rebellion against her old self-consciousness, tying her hair back instead of letting it fall like a curtain, standing a little straighter when speaking to patrons, even laughing freely when Daniel teased her gently about her love for collecting abandoned books. One evening, as she was shelving returns, she caught sight of herself reflected faintly in the library's tall window. For the first time, she didn't flinch. She studied the outline of her face, the mark that had defined so much of her identity. And she whispered to her reflection, almost daring herself, "You're not ugly." The words trembled but didn't shatter. Her transformation wasn't just about appearance. It was about trust. She began to share more with Daniel. That she wrote poetry sometimes but never showed it to anyone. That she had once dreamed of teaching but had been too afraid of standing in front of classrooms. Each confession felt like loosening a chain. And each time, Daniel listened without judgment. as though her secrets were treasures instead of burdens, and slowly, she realized her heart didn't feel as guarded anymore. It still hesitated, still quivered with fear, but it also beat with a new, cautious hope. Daniel hadn't cured her insecurities, but he had given her something she hadn't dared to give herself, permission to believe she was more than what the world saw. For the first time in her life, Lila felt the edges of possibility. And that, more than anything, was beautiful. Spring came slowly that year, as if the world itself were reluctant to shake off the long winter. Each morning, the air softened a little more, the trees lining Lila's walk to work swelling with buds, the scent of earth and rain promising new beginnings. For Lila, the season seemed to echo her own quiet transformation. She no longer rushed to the mirror each morning in dread. Makeup still had its place on some days. She wore it as a kind of gentle polish, the way others might choose a favorite scarf or earrings, but it was no longer her armor. On other mornings, she stepped outside with her face bare, the mark visible, her hair pulled back. The first time she walked into the library like that, her heart pounded so fiercely she thought everyone would hear it, but no one stared. No one whispered. Children still tugged their parents toward story hour. Students still came with their laptops. The elderly patrons still asked for help finding their favorite mystery novels. The world hadn't shifted around her. It had only shifted inside her. And then there was Daniel. He had noticed, of course. The day she first greeted him without makeup, he paused, not with surprise, not with discomfort, but with a slow, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He didn't comment on the change. He didn't need to. His gaze held the same warmth it always had, as though nothing had changed at all. That, more than any words, gave her strength. Their friendship deepened, moving gently into something more. Daniel began to walk her home sometimes, carrying her bag when it grew heavy with books she insisted she didn't need but couldn't resist. They lingered in conversation at the corner cafe near her apartment, sipping tea and coffee until the café sky bruised with twilight. He shared more of his own world stories of travels abroad, of languages that had shaped the way he thought, of the loneliness that sometimes haunted a life lived between places. And she shared more of hers. One evening, with trembling hands, she placed a notebook on the cafe table between them. "I write," she confessed, voice nearly breaking. "I never show anyone. But maybe you could read one?" Daniel opened the notebook carefully, as though it were fragile glass. He read silently, his eyes moving across the page. When he looked up, there was no hesitation in his voice. "These are beautiful, Lila. You are a poet." The words stunned her, left her breathless. For years she had hidden those pages, convinced they were unworthy. But in his voice, in his certainty, she felt the stirrings of belief. Weeks passed, and with them, her courage grew. She laughed more easily, spoke more openly, even stood before a small group during poetry night at a local bookstore, her voice trembling but steady enough to read her own words aloud. When she finished, she glanced at Daniel in the crowd, and the pride in his eyes steadied her more than the applause. Her life was no longer confined to the safe, small circle she had built. It expanded slowly, tenderly into something larger. She still had her insecurities. Some days, the old whispers rose again, but they no longer controlled her. They no longer defined her. On a warm evening in May, walking together beneath blossoming trees, she turned to Daniel. Her voice was soft, but no longer trembling. "Do you really mean it?" she asked. "When you say I'm beautiful?" He stopped, turning to face her fully. His hand reached for hers, strong and sure. "Lila," he said, "I've never meant anything more in my life." This time she didn't look away. She let the words sink deep, allowed them to settle where fear once lived. And when she smiled, it wasn't a shy, careful smile, it was radiant, unburdened. Wholly hers, For the first time, Lila walked forward not in hiding, but in hope. And beside her was someone who had seen her, truly seen her, and called her beautiful, not despite the mark she bore, but with it.